Joe Rogan Podcast, check it out.
The Joe Rogan Experience.
Dre by day, Joe Rogan Podcast by night. All day. Which is great because I think he just like records this in the middle of the day, so I don't think he does it at night.
Yeah, I don't understand a single one of these 3 audio clips.
Neither do I. Welcome to Podcast. Hello, and welcome to Podcast. It's a podcast where we review podcasts. I'm Sam.
I'm Honor.
And today, Honor, aren't you excited? Aren't you joyous for the special occasion that we have today? Okay.
So excited. You've seen the title of this episode.
So, we're reviewing the Joe Rogan Experience, the most popular podcast on planet Earth.
Yeah, buddy.
And Honor, I'm not going to say you've been a hater. I'm not going to say you've been hating on my idea.
I'll say I've been a hater.
You haven't wanted to review Joe Rogan show.
No.
What? But it's the most popular podcast ever. I feel like we gotta do what the people want. All the people are listening to Joe Rogan.
All the people.
I don't know.
It's such a divisive podcast.
It is.
Because it is so popular, and yet I don't think I've personally ever talked to a single person who's like, yeah, the Joe Rogan Experience.
Well,
that's a good podcast.
We have noted several times that we have specific niches in podcasting, and I feel like yours might be slightly stronger than mine. You know,
I think
you might
that's
have
probably true.
More burrowed in. I have talked to people that listen to Joe Rogan. I've listened to Joe Rogan before I listened to the apps for this show.
Really?
Yeah.
You did not tell me that.
Yeah, no, he's the most popular podcast.
I guess.
Yeah, I've listened to Joe Rogan.
I think also, to be fair, I have close to zero interest in like interview podcasts.
Yeah.
Which is also a reason
Yeah.
that I'm like, I wouldn't listen to this in the first place. And then it has the reputation that it has.
Yeah, so let's dive in. This podcast,
It's a beast.
It's a beast. Well, for me, this has been such a journey to try to understand the Joe Rogan Experience because I started to listen to this in October.
Well,
so I've been listening to this for a while, and that may make it sound like I'm like tuning in every day, but I have not. I've listened probably still more than I do for other podcasts we talked about. I've probably done more than 15 hours, maybe close to 20 hours of Joe Rogan podcast. For this episode, I listened to his interview with Bill Burr, Adam Sandler, Theo Vaughn, Elon Musk, Donald Trump, and then his like Comedy Boys Protect Our Parks episode. And it's just, it's been so much to try to wrap my head around.
Yeah. Yeah, I did not hit as much. It's just, even just the sheer number of episodes. It's like, how are you ever going to get even a semi-comprehensive idea of what's going on here without spending like 6 months? Yeah.
That's so true. So let's for people who don't know what the Joe Rogan Experience is, let's cover that very, very briefly. So the Joe Rogan Experience is a podcast by comedian Joe Rogan. And it's an interview podcast. You know, It's him and usually one other guest they bring on, and he just like talks to them, asks them questions. More than it being an interview podcast where it's like, there's some like very structured interview podcasts, you know, which are like, what's your favorite book? I ask everybody this, but do you have a dog? You know, like this is just like Joe Rogan talking to a guy about what he thinks is interesting about that person. And that's like kind of the intent, and I think that's the appeal for many people, is that it's kind of a very casual conversation. But there are also so many episodes. If we are to check his YouTube, he just released one day ago episode 2,239.
Wow.
He releases like 2 or 3 of these a week. And the other crazy part about this is that every episode is so long.
Yeah.
Like 3 hours is standard just like looking through.
Yeah, I definitely think 2 to 3 hours is about the mark.
Yeah. Sometimes it's 2 hours. Sometimes it's 3 hours. Sometimes it's 4 hours.
Mm-hmm.
These are long episodes. I know we've historically disagreed on what is and is not a long podcast.
Yeah. And I mean, definitely I see 2 to 3 hour mark and I'm like, okay, yeah, there's a lot of podcasts that do that, especially that I listen to because I listen to longer things than you. But also, I think for an interview podcast, I think it's way more common for an interview podcast to be half an hour to maybe an hour and a half if it goes long.
Right.
I don't think I've ever seen another interview podcast that is this long per episode.
Yes. And there are other podcasts like this, and Joe Rogan has kind of carved out that niche for them.
Mm-hmm.
Like, what comes to mind is like the Lex Fridman podcast, which is very similar, which is hosted by computer scientist guy Lex Fridman.
Yep.
But yeah, it's really long, and it's not like a scripted interview. I think Joe Rogan comes up with like some questions he has.
Yeah, maybe.
And has
debatable from what I've seen.
Yeah. Well, that's also true. Is usually it feels like he has some thoughts, you know?
Mm-hmm.
His most popular, most viewed episode on YouTube is him talking to this UFO conspiracist guy who says he worked at like a government facility working on like aliens and UFOs.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think with those, like he like has ideas that he wants to talk about, but sometimes he will just be like, "Hey man, you've seen UFC? You know UFC fights?"
Yeah.
Because Joe Rogan is a comedian, has been a comedian since like the 90s, but is also for a long time been into martial arts and has been a UFC commentator.
Mm-hmm.
In case you're curious, most of his video game appearances credited on his Wikipedia page are him as commentators in the UFC fighting games. So
that is funny.
Just in case you wanted to know them. Yeah, so it's kind of this casual interview thing, right? But it's also so much more than that because it is the most popular podcast in the world.
Yeah.
Which I think me and Honor are of one mind on this is crazy.
Yes. Especially, just to put it very simply, because after listening to it, which admittedly a very small slice of this huge pie, is like nothing crazy or notable even really happened. It was like it was like a slightly subpar podcast from what I saw. So it's like, why is this the most popular podcast in the world?
It's so interesting. So we were talking about this. You listened to the Kevin Hart episode, Neil deGrasse Tyson episode, and the Adam Sandler episode.
Yes.
So you picked out some guys you knew that you liked, and you're like
vaguely,
yeah, or you recognized.
Yeah, I've seen Adam Sandler's name on things before.
I like Billy Madison.
I don't even know what that is.
You know what?
I don't know famous people.
Billy Madison is a movie.
Oh. I live under a rock.
Okay, whatever.
But yeah. Here's some names I recognize. Let's see what happens when Joe Rogan is also there. Because apparently it's super popular.
So what was your experience with that? Because I listened to mostly his recent things. Mm-hmm. I say recent. Now, when you're listening to this, it's not going to be recent, right? Because it was always like the most recent thing when I would listen to it.
Yeah.
So then what was your experience? Because you kind of went back in the catalog. Kevin Hart's episode was in 2019.
Yeah.
So what was your experience? Was it more of just an interview, or was it just like kind of hanging out, shooting the breeze type of thing?
Definitely was more of the hanging out, like this guy is just talking kind of thing. So I'll go through each episode. Kevin Hart, I think Kevin Hart's a funny guy. I've watched Jumanji. I like when he's in bad movies. It's funny.
Whoa, you think Jumanji's a bad movie?
I think I had fun watching it. I think critics would say it's bad.
Okay. I don't know. If it was an enjoyable film, I don't know that it's a bad film. You know what I mean? It may not be artsy.
I say bad with a positive connotation. when people are like, this is not a critically acclaimed film, but I like it because I want to go be silly for a bit. That's what I mean. But
we'll
we're
talk
not
about
here
Jumanji.
to review.
I got thoughts on Jumanji. We'll talk about it. We'll talk about it.
We'll
off
talk
mic.
about that. If they made a Jumanji podcast, we should review it. That'd be awesome.
Certainly, it exists. But Kevin Hart almost certainly isn't in it.
No, wish he was. But I listened to that episode, and I don't know. It is interesting in the fact that he kind of just showed up and he was saying all these things about the things he'd learned from his life. He didn't actually talk about
Kevin Hart?
Yeah, Kevin Hart. He actually didn't talk about comedy that much. They definitely talked about comedy, but yeah,
sure.
I was expecting more talking about comedy, and he ended up more talking about like how he handles his work-life balance, his experience being a famous person. Like they talked about how he navigates like the internet and like phones and stuff a lot. Honestly, yeah, it was strange. And I almost have a slightly lower opinion of Kevin Hart after this episode, because he was saying all these things that were like kind of just lukewarm takes about like how to be happy, how to not let the internet get you down.
Hey man, don't pay attention to the haters.
Yeah, just quite frankly, stuff like that. Like I think at one point Joe Rogan asked him like, how does this work for you? And he just goes, "I'm just a genuinely happy guy."
That's awesome.
I'm like, that's awesome. Happy for you, Kevin Hart. Least helpful thing to say in the world. To be like, well, I'm just happy.
See, that is a drastically different conversation than the one they had for the Adam Sandler podcast that we both listened to. Because that one, they just kept talking about comedy, and they kept just being like, oh, man, like Tony Bellucci, that guy murdered.
Yes.
Oh, it destroyed.
Okay,
that guy was so funny. It was a massacre. Like, it was just the same thing.
Yeah.
But, like, different from the Kevin Hart episode.
Yeah. But then, like I said, Kevin Hart kept having all these, like, lukewarm tanks. But then Joe Rogan would be like, oh, my gosh, that's so wise. And that's, like, pretty much all he said all episode was being like, like, you're such a productive guy. How do you do it? Just, like, the most basic questions in the world.
Yeah.
And then would get the most basic answers in the world and would be like, wow, that's incredible. That's amazing. And I'm like, what? This guy's saying nothing. You're both saying nothing.
So
felt like so much nothing.
This is something that and I want to talk about this more later on, like why I think this is a successful podcast.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't think like Joe Rogan, he's not like a journalist. You know what I mean?
No.
He's not like getting these hard hitting questions.
Yeah.
But I think some of the key to his success is kind of being the everyman.
I think that could be very possible.
Yeah, just kind of asking just normal like dude questions, being like, hey, so like what's it like to be a short guy in a big career,
Yeah, especially when I listened to like the Neil deGrasse Tyson episode. Honestly, that episode, I didn't end up finishing it, but I might, just because Neil deGrasse Tyson is really interesting to listen to. And that's honestly why that episode was good, was because honestly Joe Rogan barely talks. Like, Neil deGrasse Tyson just talks about science and stuff and, like, how the Hubble telescope works.
Yeah.
And all these really interesting things. And he's very eloquent in the way that he puts things, and he makes it very accessible and understandable to regular people. And Joe Rogan, quite frankly, is there asking really mundane questions like, so wait, what do we think is the source of... What are the theories about the Big Bang?
Sure.
How's it work?
Yeah.
How does the telescope work? All these like really basic questions where honestly I was like, just let Neil talk. Like just move out of the way.
Yes. That I think that's a really interesting thing to hit on again, to be like, what is successful about this podcast?
Yeah.
Because, and I kind of talked about this when we talked about the Conan O'Brien interview podcast, is, I think there's interview podcasts where it's like you're there for the interviewer or the interviewee.
Yeah,
and
I think when you're the number one podcast in the world and you can get any person that people are interested in ever, when you can get the ex-president on your podcast,
yes,
people will listen to that.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I think it's on that scale of interviewer to interviewee interest. I think it's slightly closer to interviewee
Yeah.
But it's not as far as some other people.
I would agree.
But I think you're also like, it's a great thing to hit on for the Neil deGrasse Tyson episode, which is just like,
he's just good at talking.
yeah, you know, ask the questions I want to know.
Yeah.
And then I just want to hear what Neil deGrasse Tyson has to say.
Yeah. Yeah, and then the last episode I listened to, which you also listened to, the Adam Sandler episode, was interesting because it felt different in that, like, Joe Rogan had more to say because they were talking about things that they both were knowledgeable about.
Yeah.
And they kept talking about people that they both knew, quite frankly, especially because it was always so jarring and weird to me whenever they would start the episode, and there's no intro at all or being like, here's my guest, like, whatever. They just start talking.
Yeah.
And I feel like I've missed the first 5 minutes of the episode.
I know.
But especially with Adam Sandler, they just start that way, and it feels like they're just talking about things they know about, and you're like, I don't feel like I have all the context for the things they're talking about because they're just talking to each other. That's how I felt the whole time listening to the two of them talk about comedy and comedians that they knew and their experiences, and being like, literally at one point I think he's like, oh yeah, remember that time I like saw you at the airport and whatever. I'm like, dog, I'm not involved in this conversation at all, which is weird because I do enjoy when there's conversational podcasts when people clearly have chemistry, people are friends, and that can feel really infectious and you can feel drawn in by that. Did not happen at all with this episode for me. It was like, oh, I'm not getting any of the inside jokes. You guys, why did you record this and put this on the internet? You guys are just hanging out for the two of you. So that was my experience.
Yeah, I definitely don't. I know exactly what you're talking about, right? That's what we did at the beginning of this episode.
Mm-hmm.
He has his little intro.
Yeah, he has the 3 sound bites that don't make sense, and then they start talking.
And then they start talking, and I think, in part, that is kind of a credit to how famous the people are that he gets on his show.
Mm-hmm.
They need no introduction,
yeah.
right? Like, you know who Adam Sandler is.
Yeah.
But I didn't have the same experiences on that episode because I knew most of the people that they were talking about,
I guess,
and like
yeah.
I was interested in like the comedy that they were talking about. But I had a similar feeling in that they kept being like, "Oh, dude, that guy is so good, just killed so good," and it's just like, I'm not. This actually isn't that interesting.
Yeah,
to me.
no, because even in other podcasts and stuff that I've listened to, where I don't know what the people are talking about, but they have chemistry and it's clearly an infectious friendship that they have, and I'm like, I don't need to know what they're talking about. They're talking about it in an interesting way. But no, they would just be like, oh my gosh, this guy's so funny. He kills it every time. Or like, this guy's like, whatever. Just like, this is not interesting. You guys are just talking.
Yeah. So let's get to that. I think, we'll give our ratings and stuff here. But like, as an experience, I got some problems with the Joe Rogan Experience.
Yeah.
Like, it's huge, and he's getting amazing guests, and I appreciate that.
Yeah.
I think the episodes are way too long, dude.
They're really long for a lot of nothing.
You like to listen to a lot of long episodes for like D&D podcasts where there's like a story that's developing.
Yeah. I've listened to a lot of long podcasts, and they are okay to be long because there's stuff going on all the time.
Right. It's like almost an audiobook.
Yeah.
You know, like you're fine listening to a 20-hour audiobook because it's a story or something.
Mm-hmm.
But like, it's kind of sometimes being a silent observer in a 3-hour conversation. It's tough. There's a lot of these episodes that I'm like, I have to finish this because I'm reviewing it for Podfight but I don't want to.
Yeah.
I'm not interested.
No, I just did not finish them. I did not finish that Adam Sandler episode.
Yeah.
I got 45 minutes, maybe an hour in.
There's so much left.
There's still so much left, and I was like, I thought eventually they would get to a point where there was a groove in the conversation, and I'd feel like, okay, I'm with you now. Never happened.
Yeah, like I think that's kind of the problem is sometimes I think he does have people that he gets along really well with. Like I listened to his Save the Parks episode, which is him and 3 other of his comedy buddies just talking and getting, absolutely intoxicated. You know? but they are able to just talk and say nonsense at each other for a while, you know, and even into like hour 3, I'm like, that was a pretty funny bit. You know what I mean? But on some of these, it's just not. It's so it's asking for so much of your attention for such a long period of you to consume it, when I don't think it's warranted on a lot of these episodes. It's like, dude, you're not making interesting content, right? And I think, you know, that was my experience. You know, that's why people edit podcasts, right? To get down to just like the good part. Joe Rogan's taking a different strategy, right? I mean, he's putting out hours and hours of content.
Yeah.
You know, if Joe Rogan is your comfort person, you know what I mean? Like if you're working or driving or whatever, and you're like, I want to put on a little Joe. Boom. It's always going to be there. It is inconceivable to me that you could run out of Joe Rogan. Yeah. Unless you're listening to him, unless you've 8 hours a day, every day.
Yeah, and you've been there from the start.
Yeah. But for me, a lot of these episodes were just way too long. Yeah. And I would just be like, I would not be having a fun time, and I'd be like, how much of this is left? Oh my God, 2 hours. I just started.
Yes. Which also, let's point out the crazy thing about being like, this is a boring subpar podcast, is that its reputation is that it's crazy. And that he talks to crazy people.
Let's talk about its reputation, because if, listener, you knew Joe Rogan coming in, like you knew the podcast coming into this, then you might know it for its controversies, right? So there's been a bunch of controversies involving Joe Rogan and involving the podcast, and I wrote down some of them, and I wanted to talk about them briefly. But it is kind of, I don't know, maybe it's strange, maybe it really isn't. It's supposed to be the most popular podcast, but it's also gotten a lot of flack. Yeah. You know, it's also gotten in trouble for things. So I wrote down some of the incidents, and I kind of wanted to talk about them. I think you'll get why. So I think for a lot of people, the Joe Rogan podcast has kind of a negative perception if you haven't listened to it. And I feel like that was kind of true for you, right, Honor? When we listened to it, you're like, oh my gosh.
I was like, I don't want to do this.
This guy, it sounds like a whack job. Yeah. Right? But, you know, you can take a sample of episodes like you did. Yeah. No whack jobbery, right? No. You didn't hear anything crazy or like...
No. There was some, like, I don't know, maybe iffy stuff where he was saying things with Kevin Hart that I was like, you guys seem really confident in these, like, meh stances where you really feel like you're in the right, and it's like, maybe you should let go of your ego a little bit.
Sure.
But that was like the closest it got when it has this huge reputation for being absolutely insane, which is not the same scale at all.
Right. So Joe Rogan has gotten into some genuine controversies and some real trouble. And so I want to talk about those. If you want to know more about these, Google them. I don't know all about them. I skimmed the footnotes to talk about them briefly. Joe Rogan got in trouble when somebody posted a compilation of him saying the N-word online. And he issued this apology, and he's like, I'm very sorry. This was, inappropriate conduct. And then later he was like, he called it a political hit job. He was like, that was stupid. He was really mad about it because he said that all those clips were taken out of context. He was using the N-word to like reference somebody else using it. Like that he was, like quoting someone. Yeah. And he had a bunch of fighters in the UFC who were like, this sucks. We are with Joe. He's not a racist guy. We like him, So a lot of these, black UFC fighters were like, you guys don't be mad at Joe Rogan for being racist. We don't think he's racist. It's fine. So that was one. He's also gotten in trouble for being a climate denier. He's, got in trouble for being climate change denier. I did a little digging on this one. It seems a little iffy. He did have a guy on his podcast who was kind of like, not a climate change denier, but was playing down the effects that humans have on climate change. And so it's not like Joe Rogan's going around being like, the world needs more CO2. It's actually cool, Yeah. But he is, having heard some of his comments, he is also a little bit downplays,
Yeah.
some human interaction on that, but I don't know. Nothing cancelable in my opinion. And then the thing he got in the most trouble for was during the COVID lockdown days, he had some stances on COVID. Mostly, he thought that lockdown should be ended sooner rather than later.
Mm-hmm.
And he was a proponent of this drug called ivermectin. Ivermectin, so he, says that he's been prescribed by his doctor, ivermectin, to help treat COVID. And, news agencies pick this up and they're like, Joe Rogan is taking a crazy horse dewormer to stave off COVID, which is true. Ivermectin, can deworm horses, but it is also for humans. It's just an anti-parasitic medication. And he got in a lot of trouble for spreading this misinformation that ivermectin is going to stop you from getting COVID, which scientists say this is not true. At the time, they're we don't think this is happening. I think there was a study which was ivermectin might help, and then subsequent studies are we really don't think it will.
Yeah.
And so he got in a lot of trouble for this. So at the time, Joe Rogan's podcast was hosted exclusively on Spotify, and other creators on Spotify like Neil Young, I think, amongst others, Joni Mitchell, I think as well. Big musicians were we're going to take our music off Spotify unless Spotify drops Joe Rogan.
Whoa.
And then Spotify was do it. And then they did. So there's this whole big kerfuffle about, Joe Rogan and what he thinks about COVID, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's true. Joe Rogan really does. He really did take ivermectin, and he really is ivermectin is good. It's good for you,
Yeah, that was definitely a thing that came up several times weirdly in the episodes I listened to, is that he's constantly talking about taking supplements for stuff that I'm
Joe Rogan's a big health guy.
Yeah.
And he believes largely in exercise and not necessarily a balanced diet. I think he believes more in the you should eat lots of meat kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And is kind of a little bit on the supplements train.
Yeah.
Which I don't know.
I mean, very much on the supplements train. Kevin Hart was talking about how he was starting his own line of supplements.
Oh, hell yeah.
And Joe Rogan was like, that's awesome. Yeah, I've taken whatever. Yeah.
I mean, and I'm also you know what? Maybe he is right. I don't know about supplements, but Joe Rogan is jacked. Have you seen him? He's muscle bound. He's huge.
He's huge.
But Joe Rogan, this kind of gets at a deeper thing, which is that Joe Rogan kind of has this belief that, how to describe this, that we as the common people don't know the entire and real truth about things that are happening in the world.
Yeah.
He kind of thinks that he's pharmaceutical companies will suppress information or drugs that can help people, that kind of thing. He'll believe that hey man, the government has an interest in lying to you sometimes, or this person will lobby and be you need to eat vegetables. He's you don't need to eat vegetables, and these aren't the things I'm saying right now aren't necessarily his takes, but that's kind of the realm in which some of his beliefs reside.
Yeah.
Which is strange. And it kind of leads us into some of the episodes I listened to of his. The more recent thing is because Joe Rogan interviewed former and future president of the United States, Donald J. Trump, right? And, I got to say, so I listened to that episode. Interesting conversation. There were some goofs and some gaffes, but it was interesting. I learned more about Trump than I knew before. I was I haven't heard him talk this way. That is interesting. Trump goes on to win the election, and now it feels like Joe Rogan has kind of got placed in this box in some people's views I think particularly by some of like, you know, the big news agencies of being like, Joe Rogan is now a like right-wing conspiracy theorist.
Mm-hmm.
And having listened to some of his episodes, more recent episodes, it was certainly very political.
Mm-hmm.
The Donald Trump episode was very political.
Yeah.
The Theo Von episode was very political. The Elon Musk episode was very political. The one where he's hanging out with his buds, super political.
Mm-hmm.
Like every episode, he would just be like, "Can you believe that election? This is awesome!" You know, because he endorses Trump right before the election. And so, as an undercurrent of all these political discussions, right? Because it usually starts out like Theo Von is a comedian.
Mm.
I've listened to some Theo Von stand up. Funny, I enjoy. But Theo Von came on and Joe Rogan was like, "Dude, that election is crazy." And Theo Von's like, "Yeah." And then Joe Rogan's like, "Yeah, man. The deep state, they were coming after him." I don't know. He didn't say the deep state. And I know that this is political, so I don't want to misrepresent this.
Mm-hmm.
But it was weird because Joe Rogan does genuinely hold some of these beliefs that, like, he was like, you know, he thought that there was some, like, this is so hard to describe because some of these, like, stances that Joe Rogan has are not solid and concrete things he says, right?
Yeah.
He doesn't say, like, I believe Joe Biden is a robot. But he will say, I don't know, man. I think they were hiding something about Joe Biden. It felt weird. This guy is old. What's going on with this, right?
Yep.
And it's like, hey, man, I don't know, you know, what's going on in this sphere of politics. But it does, time and time again, he'll kind of bring up this concept of, like, in politics and things aren't always what they seem, you know? Like, there is this angle of people might be lying to you. Those with authority might be, you know, like misrepresenting the truth and trying to pull one over on normal people.
Yeah.
Which is, like, weird.
Yeah.
You know, it feels weird because it also, I know some of the things that Joe Rogan says isn't right, you know?
Yeah, I think you're right that it's hard to put a pin in because it's not necessarily things he's saying super boldly and explicitly, but there's even an undercurrent of those ideas in the stuff I listened to that never got super political. The closest they got to was in the Kevin Hart episode talking about, like, cancel culture, kind of.
Yeah.
But there's almost this focus on what are the things you don't know and that people aren't telling you and that the big man, like whoever that ends up being, wants to hide from you, instead of focusing on what are things that are, like, true and cool that are happening and whatever.
Yes. It is this, certainly this belief that, like, conspiracies are possible, right? Mm-hmm. And, like, I don't know, you know, the truth and to some of the things he says, right?
Mm-hmm.
But it does feel weird. It feels weird sometimes knowing that I'm like, I think there's, like, incorrect information in here somewhere.
Yeah.
But I don't know where. And when someone's telling me I can't trust anything, it just gives you this strange perspective.
Yeah.
You know? So, like, for example, like, I know that Joe Rogan gets things wrong sometimes. He was talking with his buddies in the, like, comedian hangout episode. He said that Joe Biden fired a Ukrainian prosecutor who was going to prosecute his son for, like, crimes he had, you know, for corruption or something like that. And then Jamie is his, like, producer guy. Yeah. If you see any clips of Joe Rogan online, it'll usually be him like, "Hey, Jamie, pull up that video of that monkey tearing off that woman's face." All right. Yeah. You know, does that a lot. But then Jamie's like, "Hey, so I looked this up because you wanted to know about this. It turns out that Joe Biden and the, like, other people involved, you know, at least the other Democrats in the Obama administration said they pressured Ukraine to fire this prosecutor because he wasn't investigating corruption." And people on like the Republican and like Trump camp were like, no, it's because he was going to investigate Hunter Biden.
Mm.
And Joe kind of tends like he's like I don't trust these guys in charge, you know?
Yeah.
So it just feels like one, if Joe hadn't got fact checked on that one, and which he does, he'll ask Jamie for a fact check from time to time because I think he's aware. He's like, I've gotten in trouble before. Hold on, let's fact check it. If he hadn't got fact checked on that one time, I think it would have really misrepresented what happened because it's really a he said versus she said why this particular like political event happened.
Yeah.
Right. But even when he got fact checked, he still sides kind of on one side a little more than the other. Right. This kind of I think fundamental mistrust in authority, or at least like current Democrats in authority is what it feels like as well.
Mm-hmm.
And so it just feels strange that you like I'm like I feel like some of the things I'm learning is like misinformation, but I don't know what. But the other thing is other things he says are just right,
Yeah.
Like on the Bill Burr episode, he was trying to talk to Bill Burr about Chaz, Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone, I think is what it was called. During the summer of 2020, a bunch of like a Black Lives Matter protest turned into this occupying of like a particular neighborhood in Seattle. And it was kind of this experimental anarchist like block of a neighborhood, and they wouldn't let cops in, and they tried to provide their own like social services and stuff. Okay. Joe Rogan, who you kind of know is a little bit like your conspiracy theorist uncle, when he talks about this, you're like, dude, what are you talking about? That's not real. And then you look it up and you're like, whoa, this is an insane Wikipedia article. You mean there's a whole Wikipedia series on anarchism in Seattle? I'm fascinated, And so it's this strange thing because Joe Rogan is a guy who knows a lot, but then he'll also say things to you and you look it up and you're like, that is either untrue or I disagree with how you've interpreted these events.
Yeah.
So for me, it gave me this really weird feeling, like listening to Joe Rogan sometimes be political and try to be like, oh, but do you know about this thing that happened? Because it's like, did this really happen? It's eroded a little bit of my trust in him, But that also feels weird because for me, like, there will be people who go after Joe Rogan, right? Like, one of the ladies on The View, like the women's talk show, The View, mocked Joe Rogan for believing in dragons, which is a hilarious thing.
That is funny.
And is genuinely funny. But Joe Rogan doesn't believe in dragons. You know what I mean? Like, it's not like he's gone anywhere in his, show been like, I believe in dragons. They were real. And men rode them into the sunset. It was beautiful. Like, that's just not like a thing he thinks or a stance he holds. So it's weird when people like criticize him and then they're wrong, but then he's also wrong.
Yeah.
But he's not, this isn't like a news show. He's not trying to be right. It's just like his feeling. Okay.
It's for sure a byproduct of the fact that it's the number one podcast in the world.
Yeah.
So then anything you say, like, you have to be
people
aware
are gonna
that
latch
so
onto.
many people are listening.
Yes.
So many people are hearing this.
But the whole point of the show is that it's a casual conversation.
Yeah.
And we say things to each other in casual conversation all the time that are not true.
Yeah.
Humans are not fact-checking machines.
Yeah.
And it's like, but also you can't have a real conversation or really listen to somebody when you are trying to fact-check them in the back of your head all the time.
Yep.
You're not engaged, and it's not a good experience.
No. Just makes you feel paranoid.
Yes. Especially when, like,
it's not fun.
Some of the things they're saying are like paranoid-y things.
Yeah.
It was a very strange experience for me. And also, that was a lot of the focus for the Donald Trump, Theo Von, and Elon Musk episodes, where a lot of these kinds of topics, they would talk about censorship, who had control, and who was like driving narratives and stuff like that. It felt really weird.
Yeah. It is a weird thing. If you have an audience as big as he has, there is, which this is also something that he seemed to downplay in certain ways in conversations he had with other people, that when you have an audience that big, when you have people listening to you, there's a certain amount of responsibility, because they would talk about just like cancel culture type of stuff and being like, people apologize, but everyone's looking for the negative and everyone's trying to like cancel you. And it's like, okay, yeah, there's a culture that there's issues with, but also you can't just be like, well, it should be fine if I'm saying things that are wrong, which is it's a weird thing to be like, I'm going to have this casual style of a show,
right,
but I'm also going to try to say things or put out ideas that are strong. Like when you were saying he was talking to this person, was like, wasn't that a crazy election? And they're like, yeah, dude, whatever. It doesn't move on. He's like, yeah.
And in some sense, that really does feel like, especially the Theo Von episode, who's a comedian.
Uh-huh.
That was a weird one because Theo Von was like, man, I'm just not feeling funny today. Like, it was a really strange episode.
That's
but
funny.
It felt like listening to your, like, conspiracy theory uncle, who was like, but who just kind of wanted to keep on it.
Yeah, there's a weird juxtaposition of, like I said, that, like, casual style. It's just very conversational. And kind of the conspiracy uncle feel. Yeah. But also, it is the #1 podcast in the world. And he's talking to, like, the president and stuff.
Right. Well, and
there's a juxtaposition there.
It is strange. You also said, and I've been thinking about this concept that if you have a large enough audience, you have a responsibility, to something. Responsibility to the truth, responsibility to... to maybe some sort of like values, or like you shouldn't be saying.
If nothing else, you just got to be aware of it.
Yeah.
And know that you're going to have an impact instead of the attitude he seems to have, which is, well, everyone else should just handle themselves, which is a true thing. But again, if you're going to be putting things on the internet for a million bajillion people to hear, that's different than just talking to your buds.
It feels a little blasé, you know. It feels like hey, not my problem.
Yeah,
I think he's aware of it. I don't know if he feels that responsibility, and like I don't know what the right, like, we're not gonna figure out the answers to the information age today, but like I don't know that he has a responsibility. Like, should Joe Rogan not talk about his political feelings just because he has an audience? You know what I mean?
No, that's like, not entirely what I'm saying.
No, and I don't think it is, but I just I don't know where that, like, what the...
Yeah, it is more so... It's difficult to articulate, but I think trying to find the right kind of attitude to have about things, to where if you're not an expert on something and you have a large audience, you shouldn't try to say you are an expert, and that's an extreme way of saying,
right,
because he's not saying, he's not going on the Neil deGrasse Tyson episode and acting like he knows everything about astrophysics or whatever,
right.
But if he starts saying things about, his opinions about COVID-19,
sure,
and because he does have that fact checker there, but he's not always listening entirely. And he kind of stays stubborn in being like...
And he's not always asking for the fact check either.
No. But, yeah, just that attitude about not presenting yourself as the expert or as right if it's not something that you're an expert on.
Yes. And I think, and I think he'll do that. I think he sometimes, He's a stand-up comedian. He's got a career in public speaking. So even when he's like, I'm not an expert, but let me say this thing confidently, I think you're inclined to believe him because that's how we humans work,
Yeah.
Like, how do humans receive the news? From, like, the guy the village over being like, hey, did you hear what happened in Thessalonica? You just want to believe people when they tell you information.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. It's hard, but I think you're definitely like on it. It's like I don't think Joe Rogan is overly worried about his impact, right? Because
Yeah.
ultimately, he doesn't think anything that he says is wrong. And, like, none of us do, right? I'm
Yeah.
sure that we've both gotten information on this podcast wrong, you know?
Yeah, for sure.
Hey, whoa, let's not be so confident.
For sure.
It could be possible. It definitely is. But, you know, no one, like, thinks that when they're saying it. It just, all that feeling, all of that, you know, what is the right way to disseminate this information?
Yeah.
Do I trust Joe Rogan? You know, is he really even asking for my trust? This isn't a news podcast, but he kind of just, you know, you could get your news from Joe Rogan. Like,
you could.
Reasonably, you could be like, you could learn quite a few things that are going on the world, you know, because he was like, I read this article, you know?
Yeah.
In the way that your uncle would.
Yeah.
It leads to this really weird feeling for me as an audience member. I was like, this is a strange soup I'm sitting in.
Yeah. I think overall it's a very strange, nuanced, difficult to articulate. I think you said soup. I think it is a soup of attitudes and just vibes. But yeah, it just creates this strange Joe Rogan experience that I think, if nothing else, my thought is, like, imagine if I was coming on and saying, this is how the Joe Rogan podcast is, super confidently, having watched...
Joe Rogan believes in dragons.
Joe Rogan believes in dragons. You know, I've listened to 3 episodes. You've listened to however many more.
Right.
I'm still coming in here and I'm saying, here's what I've gleaned from this. Here's the experience I had. Here's what, from my studying and my knowledge of media analysis, here's what I can take out of this and what I can dissect. I'm not saying that I know all about the Joe Rogan Experience, and I'm not subtly...
You don't have a PhD in Roganomics.
Yeah. Yeah, which again, it's weird because he's most of the time not saying these things explicitly.
Right.
But there's also definitely something to the fact that I'm right now saying explicitly, I'm not an expert on the Joe Rogan podcast. I could be saying things that are wrong in this episode.
Sure.
If you don't do that, the attitude is different. Yeah. If you start talking about and discussing and analyzing a thing without saying, hey, here's how I'm not entirely qualified to be considered an expert, so that everyone knows where the flaws might be.
And I think you're like dead on and totally right. But I also think that doesn't make good entertainment. You know what I mean?
No.
Like, if you're a stand-up comedian, you're not going to be like, all right, I'm not an expert on this thing, but the war in Iraq, I mean, wow. You know, like, and that's where he gets his start, right? You know, he's kind of, even to some of his older comedy, so there's some politics in there, right?
Yeah.
Which is interesting. But I also do want to say, you know, is everything that Joe Rogan says and are all of his episodes crazy? I know we've kind of focused on that because that's what a lot of other people focus on.
Yeah, no.
Like,
yeah, so I got, like, nothing. I was like, this is boring, actually. Nothing crazy happened.
To me, there was a lot of times when I'm like, there's not a lot going on. Sometimes genuinely funny. Like, I had a few laugh out loud moments. Other times, like, interesting and informative, you know? I mean, just talking about, he had, you know, Donald Trump on. I listened to the entirety of that episode. That's interesting. That's the longest I've ever listened to a politician just talk, you know? And you get to be like, okay, that's who this kind of person is more, you know? He also had Democratic Senator John Fetterman, who I listened to just a little bit of, and I'm like, I know more about this guy and some of the things that he believes, right? And so there's some, like, genuinely, you know, informative things. You get people's opinions. I thought it was interesting listening to Bill Burr, fellow comedian, his opinions on showbiz. I think he's a funny guy. And then he's like, hey, man, this is what you should do if you're an up-and-coming comedian. I'm like, maybe that's interesting. So it's not always Crazy Town USA. And I kind of hope I probably won't keep listening, but as we get out of this political cycle, maybe the soup dissipates a little more.
Yeah.
But, you know, Joe Rogan, he kind of, you know, his most popular episode is of a UFO conspiracy theorist, right?
That is true.
You know, I think he does believe in aliens, you know, like, he's like, hey man, it's out there. And so he's like, he's still probably going to talk about these things, you know, and, you know, maybe in the same way that, like, a kind of a cryptid, like, cults and conspiracies podcast might, you know, where they like to explore those weird and spooky things that are out there. That's probably not going to go away, but I hope that this weird soup kind of dies down.
Yeah.
It hampered my experience, at least.
Yeah. Weird suspicion soup.
I think that's pretty fair. I think that's a pretty accurate summary of how I felt.
Yeah. I think that also tainted my experience a little bit because, like I said, it's not explicit things. It's just kind of an undercurrent of, like, kind of weird between the lines vibes of some things he said. But otherwise, for the most part, mostly boring. I'll probably go listen to Neil deGrasse Tyson talk on his own now.
There's a podcast that we should talk about.
That was the most interesting part, was just when Joe Rogan stopped talking.
We should go listen to Star Talk.
Let's do it.
Neil deGrasse Tyson has a beautiful voice for
He
podcasts.
does. And, I mean, he talked about how he's practiced, how to talk about things in ways that are interesting and accessible to people, and he's good to listen to.
Yeah. So I want to move on and kind of talk about, like, why is this popular and some thoughts on that. But we're going to skip over. I wrote some notes on history, but I don't want to talk about it too much. Just know that this has been going on since 2009.
Yeah.
It's an old podcast. He's been doing this for a long, long time.
Mm-hmm.
In 2024, he signed a $250 million deal with Spotify. And get this, it's not exclusive on Spotify. I don't know what they're buying from him.
Yeah.
Because from 2020 to like 2024, somewhere around there, it was a Spotify exclusive. You could only get the JRE, Joe Rogan Experience, on Spotify. Now you can get it Apple Podcasts, YouTube, all the normal places. I don't know what they're paying him so much money for, but they are paying him a bunch of money.
Crazy.
But it's, he's making his own stand-up club. He's like doing stuff with that money. So, I mean, bless him. I'm sure he's having a fun time.
Yes.
So I kind of want to talk about, why is this such a popular podcast? Because I think our two biggest things, or at least for me, that kind of hampered this experience is the weird soup we talked about. We spent a long time talking about that, but it felt really weird, kind of strange to be consciously thinking about that while you're listening to the podcast. And two, the episodes are really long for sometimes, to me, a very small amount of interesting content.
Yeah.
There's a lot of just like, they're talking. Joe Rogan, in some respects, this is a UFC podcast.
Yeah.
Joe Rogan will just talk to people about the UFC because he's really interested in it. And I got to say, I'm not that interested in MMA,
Mm-hmm.
I just didn't care. And he'd be like, Theo Von, you ever see this video of this guy getting punched in the face? Oh, that 1980 fight of these two guys? Like,
yeah. I don't know. I like MMA. I'll watch it with my dad. Yeah. I also thought he brought it up. I was like, how is this even relevant?
It's not. It's just it's just him talking. And I was like, but it happens in so many episodes.
Yes.
Because it's one of his big hobbies. I was like, I really don't care.
Yeah.
So then, kind of with these two big hangups, it's really long, and the weird soup. Why is this popular?
Yeah.
I asked some people that listen to the Joe Rogan Experience, because my journey with this podcast, I started in October. I'm like, I remember listening to Joe Rogan podcast. It was kind of funny. He's a funny guy. This is going to be kind of fun. I know he's gotten some hate. We'll find out what that's about.
Yeah.
And then I would listen to one of these episodes for like a week. I in part because I'd be like, oh, yeah, I still have an hour of that to go. I'm going to go do something else.
Yeah.
Like, this podcast made me want to not listen to podcasts.
Yeah.
Like, that's crazy.
That is insane.
Because it's not like garbage, but it's so long.
It's so much nothing.
Yeah, it was uninteresting. So my journey was like, I'm like, okay, I'm interested. I'm ready to start listening to this podcast. Oh, okay, these are long. Wow, this is going on a long time. You can't see me. I would say
he's drawing a graph. It's going down.
It's going down. And then I'm like, I don't get this. Oh man, what is this? There's a lot of politics going on. What is happening here? But like, okay, I think I get it. I think I get where like people are coming from, maybe a little bit. And then I talk to people and they're like, this is what we like. I'm like, huh. And that's like
back down a little bit.
Yeah, it's
you thought you knew, and then
not quite. It's like it's a little. I've done a U almost.
Okay.
Of my understanding. I thought I understood it. Then I was like, I don't get this at all. And now I think I'm almost back to it.
Okay.
So I talked to people. My brother, who has listened to this podcast, she's like, I listened to this a long time ago, but what I liked is that he has interesting guests.
Mm-hmm.
He has interesting people who come on and talk about cool things. There's a lot of people, looking through a lot of his episodes, I have no idea who those people are.
Yeah.
They're usually, like, frequently some brand of like, white man with a beard.
Yep.
I mean, that's, I don't know, these other people on there. That's not entirely accurate, but.
That's most of them.
Yeah. But there are some really interesting people. You know, he talked to Edward Snowden. You know, he's talked to real scientists.
Mm-hmm.
You know, there's interesting people. So I think some people listen to this because they're like, I'm going to get to hear something from, like, a cool person that exists out in the world.
Mm-hmm.
I talked to somebody else, and they told me that they listened to this podcast while at work. And they said that they just kind of, like, were interested because they're like, Joe Rogan can just talk for a long time. And he's like, I think it's interesting how they can just hold this conversation for so long.
Mm.
You know, and just kind of like, you know, enjoying the ride kind of is what it made it sound like. So I think that's it. I also think separately, as a separate explanation for me, Joe Rogan to me really feels like he is one of the central figures in what I might brand as bro media.
Yep.
You know, and kind of, I think there's a certain kind of person that I didn't get to talk to who's like, yeah, bro, hey, man, I'm going to go hit the gym. I'm going to get swole. That's what you got to do in life. You got to get gains and you got to get growth. Got to get money.
Uh-huh.
Got to get muscles and money,
yep.
You know?
For sure.
And I think that Joe Rogan kind of appeals to these guys. You know, he talks about working out a lot. He talks about health a lot, which is kind of like this fictitious, idealistic bro I'm making in my mind,
mm-hmm.
you know, kind of cares about. You know, and listener, maybe you don't know this person, and so maybe this person isn't real. But I think that when I say this, you like will have in your mind, you're like, oh, I know this kind of guy.
Yeah. Or
I see this guy on the street, and I imagine this is what his internal life is like.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that could also be, you know, this kind of person appreciates Joe Rogan for like how they kind of want to be him or how they kind of agree with some of his bro-y sentiments, you know?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think even more subtly, I think even people who aren't necessarily that idealistic bro person that you're imagining and creating here, that is an example that exists in our society, I guess, today, of you gotta care about money, gotta care about health, gotta get swole, all these things. And so even if a person isn't ticking all of those boxes, those are ideals that are big in media and society today.
Yeah.
To where, I mean, he said he brings on health experts. Kevin Hart was talking about his supplement line. There's, from what I heard talking to people, there's this attitude that he has through a lot of conversations about how do you be a successful person, which I think is extremely popular and a thing people are like, I want that knowledge and I want to tap into that, right. Especially in our current American society.
Yeah. I also think a lot of like the younger like dudes that we know.
Yeah.
You know, I feel like that's a prevailing mentality.
Yep.
Yeah. I think that's interesting you point out. It's like almost an archetype that some people take bits and pieces from and they're like, I want to try that part. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of my theories on why I think it's popular. Did you have any other explanations? I feel like I'm doing like anthropological research here to understand what people of the time were thinking.
Yeah. No, I think you're definitely right. I also think, quite frankly, once something hits a certain threshold of being popular, people check it out because it's popular. Sure. I mean, that's what we're doing right now. Yeah. Is we're saying, we're a podcast that talks about podcasts. We have to talk about the number one podcast.
Right.
So we check it out. If people want to tap into that cornerstone of society as it's constructed, I mean, not to bring up my college majors again, but in class, I'm a communication major, and we have talked about how it started to get broken down as the internet has developed, but societies have these cornerstones of things that everyone knows about. Like if there's a TV show that was always on, everyone would know it because that's what's on the channel that people will watch around dinner time.
Sure.
people want to find that thing where it's like, this is what everyone knows. And so if you walk into a conversation with someone, you can go, hey, have you heard of this popular thing? Because it's popular, they also might have heard it. You can start a conversation.
Right.
So I think, quite frankly, there's probably a lot of it that, especially now that it's reached the point that it has, it comes down to the fact that it is popular. It's a thing everyone's talking about, whether it's in a positive light or because of the controversies.
Mm-hmm.
It's a thing that then people have this fundamental drive to want to be included in that and to want to feel informed and be like, okay, yes, I can engage with that and I'm included in this larger conversation that's occurring.
This is a really interesting idea in like in the early 20th century we had the rise of mass media, right?
Yeah.
Which can make like a huge shared culture in a place or a country.
Yeah.
And we've kind of had the decline of that, in that there's so much media that you can do whatever you want.
Mm-hmm.
You don't have to, you're not restricted to, your local newspaper that syndicates, whatever articles or the national TV stations. And it's an interesting idea that almost is a response to this kind of fracturing of attention that people will be like, oh, I want to know, there's the rise of this one big podcast, a radio show, or like a piece of media where like everyone's like, other people glob onto this. Let's interact with it. Let's see what other people are doing so that I'm part of the cultural conversation. That's
and
idea.
Even among the fracturing of, there's all these different niches and subcultures that exist because of mass media. You can go find whatever you want in the subculture that you partake in. If there's going to be a cornerstone that will get outside of those smaller bubbles that exist because of the fracturing that mass media has made happen across the internet, it's going to have to be something that honestly is probably controversial, because Joe Rogan's going to draw the attention of the people who agree with him and his general attitude and vibe, and the people who don't, but are wanting to engage with it to tell him why he's wrong or whatever the thing may be. You have to be able to get attention from more than just your subculture in order to break out of that, because it has become so fractured with mass media.
We're so smart.
We're so smart.
We've got the right answer. That's what we should. Let's quit podcasting. Let's become academics.
Nah. Also, I'm saying all of this. This is what I know from my basic level college education.
Right. No,
this is how I'm analyzing.
I understand
Rogan.
You weren't publishing a paper.
Yeah.
And we were kind of both brain thinking,
Yeah, brain thinking opposed to
hand thinking.
Nice little. You made some fun little gestures.
I was about to say,
the listener.
It was
just imagine some little like.
What a small clown might do.
Yeah, imagine that.
It's kind of like fireworks. Sorry. Okay.
Yeah.
This is a visual medium.
Mm-hmm.
Whew. That's a lot on the Joe Rogan Experience.
That's the Joe Rogan Experience.
Yeah.
We've summed it up. We are the experts, actually. I take back everything I said before. You don't need to go listen or anything at all.
Could that be the subtitle to Podcast? We are the experts, actually.
We are the experts,
What makes you qualified to review other podcasts? Because we're experts.
Because we're experts.
Yeah. It's the most popular podcast. It's not for me. It's for somebody. A lot of people, turns out.
Apparently it's for a lot of people.
It's for a lot of people.
I think it's mostly boring.
Yeah, I gotta say, I didn't enjoy it. I did not have a fun time. I enjoyed some of these episodes. I enjoyed, sometimes when they were doing like comedy stuff, when they were just making jokes, I'm like, that's fun. I enjoy that. I didn't really enjoy all these interviews. I learned some stuff, but I didn't feel like I don't feel like every time I'm going to go in and learn, again, because of the soup we talked about.
Yeah.
This is not, I think at the base for me, this is a solid interview podcast. But because of these two things we talked about, because it's so long without being edited at all.
Yeah.
And because of this, weird atmosphere that Joe Rogan makes around information and stuff.
Yeah.
It takes it from me from being like a 3.5 or a 3.7 to like a 2.5, which is crazy to say.
The most popular podcast in the world
is solidly average.
Yeah,
like
I don't know.
I feel crazy saying that, but it is how I feel. Like it's not.
Yeah,
it doesn't come close to like breaking the layer into my like top podcasts.
No,
my top interview podcasts.
I'll make you feel better real quick because I'm going to be even more critical. I think Baseline, it's a subpar interview podcast because I don't even think he's a good interviewer. He has really basic questions, which
is
there's
some
some
part
appeal.
of it, I think, though.
Yeah, there's some appeal to that because it's like, okay, yeah, thank you for asking Neil deGrasse Tyson what the Big Bang is about because I also want to know.
Yeah.
But also, like when he was talking with Kevin Hart, he just was not asking any interesting, prodding questions about this guy who's doing so much.
Yeah.
So I feel like it's a subpar interview podcast to start because also there's so many interview podcasts out there.
Many.
That have way better interviewers and people who research whatever. Maybe that comes back up because he has very good guests because of the reach he has.
Exactly.
I think that does a lot of the heavy lifting for him. And then it gets brought down again by the points we've mentioned, weird soup and whatnot. So for me, a 2.
Dude, I feel like we're gonna get like blazed. You know, I feel like people are gonna
if we do,
write in the comments being like, "You guys, hate Joe Rogan."
I thought it was gonna be worse than it was. I thought I was gonna come in here and say 1.
Wow, that's great. I thought it was gonna be better than it was. I'm like I'm fairly disappointed. You know?
Yeah.
For the best podcast, I was like, this is a lot of these episodes are gonna be bangers, and I tried to listen to a lot because I'm like, okay, I want to make sure that I'm not just taking a totally lopsided sample, and I did. My sample is lopsided towards the most recent things, but in the grand,
that's fair.
I tried to be like, I mean,
that's what people are listening to right now.
There's 2,000 episodes. You're gonna, if you tune in now, you might have a similar experience to what I did.
Yeah.
Maybe you won't. I mean, he's got a lot of guests. I mean, even since the last one I listened to, there's been like 3 more guests.
Yeah.
So maybe it's totally different. But I have to say, on the whole, the aggregate of what I felt, it was disappointing.
I think I'll say I was also disappointed just because I thought Baseline would be more interesting.
You were ready for something wild and crazy.
Or even just not even that crazy. Just something crazy to happen.
Yeah.
Mostly it was boring. And then sometimes I was like, this is a little funny or interesting.
Yeah.
Mostly it was boring, though.
That's true. That's such a
where I land.
Weird, deflated anticlimax that we come to, which is just like, ultimately it's not that interesting.
No.
We just didn't.
It didn't jive with it.
It does not make me want to listen to it again. It really,
No.
I actively don't want to because I feel like I took so much time on this. And then I was really bummed out on podcasts. So I listened to this, and I listened to a bunch of these episodes, which are really long, and I was like, I didn't want to listen to podcasts because I'm like, this sucks. And then I listened to like one of my podcasts that I haven't in a long time, a history podcast that I really like. I was like, oh my gosh, podcasts are awesome.
Podcasts are good.
So, yeah. This has been a journey for me. I feel like I've come out of the other side with some knowledge, and I'm ready to leave Joe Rogan behind.
Yeah. Let's go listen to other podcasts.
Let's go listen to other podcasts.
And thank you for listening to our podcast, listener.
Listeners, send us an email. Send us your thoughts on the Joe Rogan Experience. Send us your thoughts on the podcast experience.
Yeah.
Let us know if there's any odds you want us to review, talk about. Tell us how wrong we got it. Tell us that aliens are real. If you have evidence of aliens, please email in at podpodcastcastpod@gmail.com.
That'd be awesome. But also, genuinely, I think the most interesting thing about talking about the Joe Rogan podcast is like, why is it so popular? If anyone has thoughts,
if you listen to the Joe Rogan Experience, and we like didn't cover something that you feel like, I would really enjoy. Yes.
Yeah.
I feel like we're a little on the outside, which feels strange.
Yeah.
And I want to know why. So
for being podcast people, we are on the outside.
I don't like it,
which is strange.
I want to be included.
We're supposed to be the podcast people.
So let us know your thoughts on that, or anything else. You can send us your emails at podcastcastpod@gmail.com. You can also and should leave us a review. 5-star reviews only. That's the only thing you can review.
It's the only one.
We just got our Spotify Wrapped, and we have a solid 5-star rating for 2024.
Yes.
Send us your reviews on Spotify, on Podcast Addict, on Apple Podcasts. That's how long it took me to remember Apple Podcasts. I had said Podcast Addict in between.
Said product?
You leave us a review, we'll read it out. Follow us where you get this show, so you'll know when our next episode comes out. And most of all, thank you for listening. Honor, thank you for potting with me.
Sam, thank you for potting with me.
Crisp.
Crisp.
And we'll see you next time. Bye-bye!
Bye!